The Lethbridge Public Library acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And also, if you're interested in purchasing Cheryl's book, there will be a link to the University of Lethbridge bookstore on the festival website page, so you can go there to get a copy of Cheryl's book. So, Cheryl Foggo is a multiple award-winning author, playwright, and filmmaker whose work over the past 30 years has focused on the lives of Western Canadians of African descent. Cheryl's books include 2 young adult novels, One Thing That's True from 1997, Kids Can Press, and I Have Been in Danger, 2002 from Coteau Books, as well as a children's picture book, Dear Baobab, in 2011 from Second Story Press. So we welcome Cheryl today.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So honored to be participating today in Word on the Street. I really wish we were all there together in person, but we're not. Here we are. So thank you for being with me in your homes. I also want to thank you, Caroline and Elizabeth Hegerat, for inviting me to participate, and Tom Lohr from Brush Education Press, who helped set everything up. And of course, a thank you to Brush Education Press for their reissue of my very first book, Pouring Down Rain, A Black Woman Claims Her Place in the Canadian West. I'm just going to go ahead and start reading. I've got a couple of passages chosen that I'm going to share, and I may interrupt myself here and there and talk a little bit about the process of what it was like to have a book reissued, but we'll just see how it goes. This is the preface to the second edition. Music, drawings and paintings, actors acting in films and plays, dancers dancing, poetry and books are the only actual magic we have. They offer a way for us to figure things out collectively. They allow us to care about a life someone lived in another time or place that wasn't ours. They inspire us to work on solutions for a future that we won't occupy, but that will be occupied by people we love. We're in this together. And more than any other creative endeavor of mine over a long career that is still in process, Pouring Down Rain is me talking directly to you. How fortunate I am to have the opportunity to revisit the first book I wrote, my first major literary undertaking. I've been able to correct typos that have weighed on me for 30 years. I've changed awkward phrasing here and there. I've added new information that has come to light. I've taken out a couple of things that made me shudder. There are cultural references that anyone born after 1995 won't understand, but luckily, there's the internet for those. Importantly, I've been able to reflect on things I said that I no longer believe to be true. A writer's life holds many blessings and one curse. You write things that are based on what you think is accurate at the time, and there they sit forever. So if even within this new edition, I have said things that I change my mind about later, or I've used language that falls out of fashion, please forgive me and carry on. I've also decided to let the silences stand, even if it means I've given the impression of a more cohesive family than what we actually are. There are stories in our history that are not mine to tell. So the first passage from the actual book that I'm going to share is from a chapter called Willis Augustus. Willis being not my mom's oldest sibling, but my mom's oldest brother. My mom was from a family of 9 children who grew up, almost all of whom were born in Regina and spent most of their growing up years there. And this is from a passage about a time that we were together with some other relatives visiting at my grandparents' Winnipeg home. The house was a smallish bungalow on a quiet street with a large, bright kitchen that I loved. A doorway from the kitchen led to a spare room where we were allowed to play with our cousins, with no adult shouting, "Be quiet," or "Settle it." The living room, which was filled with dark furniture and old things, was a place that I visited at night because that's where the adults would talk, while I sat silently near my mother, eagerly absorbing every word they said, every nuance, every gesture. It was not unusual during the 60s for several of my mother's siblings to be together in their parents' living room. Some of them lived in Winnipeg. The others would make plans to travel to that city at the same time. I feel quite certain that for most of them, the highlight of their year began and ended with the vacation that brought them together at 636 Ross Avenue. I learned a good deal at an early age from those gatherings. I learned how to tell a story, the importance of the family and our history, and I began to learn the way Black people, at least the kind of Black people we were, use language. My mother spoke to her family in a way that she never spoke to our neighbors at home. Sometimes she said ain't or don't when she meant doesn't, as in don't make no difference. Why I wondered, would she say don't make no difference when I knew quite well that at home she would say doesn't matter? With the exception of Aunt Edie, who had married a man from a rural Black community and adopted some of his expressions and speech patterns, none of my mother's family used expressions like y'all as part of their natural speech. One would not have known it, however, from listening to them when they were together in the security of their parents' home. Their high-spirited conversation was heavily peppered with y'alls and mm-mm-ums and other colloquialisms usually associated with rural Black American speech. I began to understand as I grew older that they did this to entertain one another and to affirm their Blackness. They were people with ambivalent feelings about their isolation from other Blacks. They had no desire to return to the America that their parents had fled, but nor did they wish to be completely swallowed by the white society in which they all lived. Talking Black to one another, to relatives, and to trusted Black friends allowed them to also feel Black. It was a method that they used to gain acceptance into the Black communities, small though they were, of Calgary, Vancouver, and Winnipeg when they left Regina. By manipulating their English, they could demonstrate to their new Black friends that although they had been raised almost exclusively among whites, they were still Black inside. One of the great things about being able to do this new edition of the book after so many years was having the opportunity to provide footnotes that helped provide further context for things. So there is a footnote on the bottom of that page that says, I had not heard of the term code switching when I wrote Pouring Down Rain, but I recognize now that this is what my mother's family was doing. One day during our 1964 visit, Uncle Willis joined our family and his brothers and sisters at their parents' home. Although he lived in Winnipeg, we did not always see him when we were there. He was a hard drinker and sometimes hard to find. He had been drinking before his arrival that night and was therefore loose and talkative. He wanted to talk about the war, a subject that he broached only when he was intoxicated. He had, as always, a cigarette with a long ash dangling from his lips and teeth as he spoke, and he stopped frequently to cough, a deep, dry, terrible cough that shook his body. The war was over, you see, he began. It had been declared over just that day, but it takes a long time to get us rolling, get us moving out of there. He coughed and coughed. We're still lying up in them old trenches in France. Well, every night a different soldier has to take his turn to go out and get us some chickens for our supper. And that night, it's my turn. We're sitting not far from a farm, so I sneak over there, and just as I'm crawling over a ridge, I come face to face with a German boy about my own age. By instinct, we both cock our guns in each other's face. Now I'm thinking, hey, this war is over. I don't have to kill this boy, and he don't have to kill me. But how do I know what he's thinking? I looked around the room at the faces of my other aunts and uncles and my grandparents. They looked a little strained, a little sad. Their spirited stories and laughter had been dampened since Uncle Willis had arrived. Some of the other uncles drank, but would never have appeared drunk before their parents, and probably not in the presence of their sisters either. They were all very sad about Willis's life, and it was clear that they had all heard this story before. But I had not. Uncle Willis continued. We stand there like that for a long time, staring at each other. Finally, I make a move with my other arm. I hold up my hand and make a V with 2 fingers. I'm trying to tell him that I don't speak no German and he don't speak no English, but we probably both want to get out of there alive. He looks relieved and lowers his gun, and I lower mine. He motions to me that he's looking for chickens, and I laugh and motion I'm doing the same. We both get our chickens and get on out of there, back to our regiments. Uncle Willis was not, excuse me. Uncle Willis was not aggressively affectionate in the way of his brothers. He probably sensed correctly that I was afraid of him. At home, we didn't associate with anyone who drank alcohol, even socially, so I was terrified of anyone who smelled of it. His drinking and the fact that he spoke very loudly due to returning from the war hearing impaired caused me, as well as my brothers and my sister, to shrink from Uncle Willis. We knew him less well than our other aunts and uncles. This bothered our mother. She wanted us to love the Willis that she knew, the Willis who she said was the smartest person she'd ever known, the Willis who once pitifully asked if God could forgive a boy who had killed in a war. He was born in 1924, the first son of his parents, and given the name Willis Augustus, Willis being his father's assumed middle name, and Augustus being the male rendering of my grandmother's favored Aunt Gussie. He was the only one of the Smith children to grow up without a partner, each of the others having had a sibling close in age of the same gender. Willis arrived between Edith and Ethel and Sidney and Ole, and was considered by some of his family to have been a loner. I have been told that during the family prayer meetings in which all of the Smiths participated, Willis sat outside on the porch and assured passers-by that the noise inside was the result of a game of cowboys the children were engaged in. Willis had lied about his age to join the Canadian Army, and the Second World War effort. He was 17 years old, and the war seemed a great opportunity to him. His efforts at school had been very promising, but he believed, as did other young Black men of his time, that with or without a high school diploma, he would spend his life at one of three occupations: pinning chickens, shining shoes, or working as a porter on the railroad. Seeing no point to an education for its own sake, he left school for the war, which offered pay along with what he perceived to be dignity and prestige. My mother was late or nearly late for school every day that Willis was away. She would walk slowly to the end of her block on Ottawa Street in Regina and wait until the telegram delivery boy came into view on his bicycle. She would stand and wait until she was certain that he had bypassed her block. Then she would run the rest of the way to school. Occasionally, he would turn onto Ottawa Street, in which case she would watch until he made his way to another, less fortunate family. One day, unbelieving, she saw the messenger continue to the very end of the block where the Smith family lived and hopped down from his bicycle in front of that big rambling house. He leaned the handlebars against the fence and walked along the crooked boards of the sidewalk. He raised his fist to bang on the door. Then my mother, Pauline, began to run. This was the standard way in which a family received news of a death then, in a black-edged envelope from a stranger on a bicycle. The telegram bearing the news of my grandfather's mother's death was still unopened in her mother's hand when Pauline burst through the door. When a loved one is ill or far away and in danger, it's odd to receive news of another death, a different death that another day would have carried its own sadness. Instead of grief, there's a moment of euphoria upon discovering that the reprieve, that the death is not the most dreaded news that one had been fearing. There is then, of course, the task of disguising the relief, a task that my grandmother and mother shared that day. 20 years later, in my grandparents' living room, I looked at my mother's face as she looked at her brother as he rambled drunkenly. He had other stories to tell. He'd had a best friend, a buddy over there, whose death had left my uncle feeling lost, abandoned. He had written the boy's family to tell them that their son had not suffered. He had met a beautiful French girl. My mother was looking at Willis as though he had died in Europe, as though it was not really him sitting there among us. At home, she always spoke of him in the past tense. He'd had so much promise. He'd been so handsome. He used to sing like a bird. She was looking at him as though his life was past. He coughed and laughed and told another story. His only injury, he said, the only damage he'd sustained through the entire war was a bite on his leg from a dog. I'm not sure if even he believed that. Just a couple of comments on that passage and what I said earlier about wrestling with the way I put things, the way I phrased things, the language I used in the first edition of Pouring Down Rain, that I had long talks with my editor, Laurie Seidlitz, about, just trying to decide how much of this book should I just leave as a representation of its time. And we decided for the most part to do that I wouldn't take a lot of time to explain how this word that we use to describe things in the world we live in today is different. There's a passage in an earlier paragraph where I use the term handicapped, and today I wouldn't use that term. There were lots and lots of places where I talked about gender and relationships that I felt were very heteronormative, and places where I might have used different language. But I decided for the most part that it would be somewhat disingenuous to change too much of the way I spoke about things. For the most part, except, as I said, for a couple of places that I thought were truly egregious, for the most part, I left them as they were. There are other things that I couldn't have known when I was writing this book. For example, that my daughter would name my grandson after Willis, and his dad, my grandpa, George. George was called George Washington Smith at the time of his birth. He was deeply embarrassed by having the name George Washington. So when he joined the army to go fight for Canada for the First World War, and his captain asked him, or his sergeant, his officer asked him, what does the W in your name stand for? He changed it on the spot. He was too embarrassed to say George Washington. So right on the spot, he said Willis. And that is how he named himself for the rest of his life. And they honored that choice by naming my Uncle Willis after him. And it really touches my heart that my grandson now also carries forward that name of Willis in his life. I had cause to be grateful to my great aunt Daisy, even more than I was at the time that I wrote Pour and Down Rain. I did acknowledge her in particular. She was her family's story keeper. And what I've been able to discover is that Aunt Daisy was a very meticulous recorder of family history, and that for the most part, the family history was very accurate, even though, of course, at the time that she was writing down her memories and hearing these stories in the early 1900s and then recording them for herself in the 40s and 50s and 60s, there was no internet. There was no possibility of Aunt Daisy going to the places where she could research American census records. She simply wrote it down as it was told to her. And through the internet and through the websites that now offer up those records for us to research from our own homes, we've been able to discover that a great deal of the story that Aunt Daisy told us about events in my family's life that went back to the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and into the 1900s were accurate. I'm going to read a little segment about my great aunts, and also show you a picture of some of them. This one is Aunt Daisy. The following day, Sharon braided my hair and helped me dress in a new skirt and sweater that my mother had sent along for me to wear. The great aunts were coming from Edmonton for a visit. I encountered Daisy and my grandfather's other 3 living sisters infrequently, perhaps once or twice in a 3-year period. And when I did see them, it was almost always for an occasion that demanded they all be there, together, like an inseparable and invincible gang. The 4 great aunts seemed to me to be significant people, holding elevated, semi-mythic status. They wore expensive coats, lipstick, and perfume, but it was their elaborate hats that intimidated me most. They were very handsome women, all of them, fair-skinned like my grandfather. I was daunted by the aggressive confidence with which this pack of ants stalked around. I behaved in their presence with the obedience and respect they would expect from one of Sun's grandchildren. Sun was what they called my grandfather because I once overheard Daisy saying, "That's what Mama and Papa called him." That day, as was their usual practice, they encircled and dissected me as though I couldn't hear them, and then they interrogated me. "Don't she look just like Reen?" one of them said, and the others nodded or replied, "Don't she though?" They admired my grandmother and were pleased enough that I resembled her rather than their brother, George. "Got the Smith eyes, though," another of them said. "Do you do good work at school?" Drusilla or Maud asked. I nodded. "Do you know who we are?" another one asked. "Aunt Daisy and Aunt Maud and Aunt Drusilla and Aunt Sis," I replied shyly. "Aunt Mary and Aunt Bessie aren't here because they're in heaven." They were satisfied and all nodded together. "You're a good girl, aren't you?" Daisy was the spokesperson for the group, and it was usually she who addressed me. I said yes. Just then Sharon interceded on my behalf, poking her head into the archway of the dining room. "I'm going to the store with Beverly, baby. You want to come?" Much relieved, I hurried to my feet. The great aunts caught me, all of them smiling. They kissed me and then dismissed me. Freed, I gladly took my leave of them, not knowing or caring that one day the great aunts, especially Daisy, would be important to me. Now that I'm a great aunt myself, I look back on those encounters that I had with my great aunts, and they seem like they were very much from another time. They had lived in a time that I simply couldn't have comprehended when I was a child. And I often wonder what it's like for my little 4 and 5 and 6-year-old grandnieces and nephews. How do they look at me? What do they think of my head wraps? What do they think of my lipstick? Does it look really old-fashioned to them? I don't know. Uh, it's a strange thing to move from life and to go from being the child to the young adult to the adult to the old great aunt. Just checking the time here. I'm not sure if you have questions. I know that we want to leave a little bit of time for a Q&A, and so I think I'm going to stop here and just check in with Caroline and see if any of you have posted any questions. And if not,
Any questions yet, but maybe that will entice people to post now that they've heard you say that. So
now that they know they can.
yeah. If you want to read another passage, or I have a question that I can always ask you.
I think I will read another short passage, and then I see a few little.
Yeah, see, now it entice people to. You can read your short passage, and then we can answer these questions.
Okay. So just so you know, I have been sort of jumping around in time in the book, so that these passages I'm sharing are not consecutive. And this is another one from my teen years, from a different visit to Winnipeg with all the aunts and uncles and cousins. I returned to Calgary from Winnipeg, not with my family in our old car, but with my Aunt Pearl, Uncle Alan, cousins Paula, Craig, and Patty Joe, the new baby. Before my mother and Pearl had children, they had agreed to help one another raise them. Pearl's first child, Daryl, died at 3 months. Following his death, she relied heavily upon my mother's calm for her next 2 children, Paula and Craig. They stayed with us while my aunt worked until they reached school age. And when I say they stayed with us, they just came and were with us during the week, sometimes spending overnight. So they didn't live with us, but we saw a lot of them. Aunt Pearl promised that she would take her turn when my mother's children reached adolescence. I confess now that when I was 14 and in subsequent years, I made her repay the debt many times over. My gregarious aunt empathized with youthful disturbances, seeming young and close to her own girlhood. She was attractive and wore trendy glasses with rhinestones embedded in the frames. I enthusiastically accepted her offer of a return ride to Calgary, settling into their Lincoln, knowing that with my uncle driving, the journey would take less than a day. Sitting in the front seat, I held the small, beautiful Patty Jo on my lap as she slept. "Did you like Howard?" I asked Aunt Pearl, referring to the great uncle that I had met in Winnipeg. "Oh, yes, yes, I like him. He was good to me when I lived in the States," she said. "Did you like him?" "Hmm, First, I was a little, I don't know. I thought he'd be older and more like Grandma." She laughed. "You won't meet a whole lot of people like your grandmother, honey." We rode along in silence. By then, we had been traveling for some hours and dusk was advancing. Uncle Alan reached for the headlight switch. "I didn't know you lived in the States," I said. "Oh, was it for long?" My aunt was yawning. "I stayed with Aunt Grace in California before I got married. Al and I had had a big fight, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to marry him. When I visited Howard in Los Angeles, he showed me the city. He took me to Disneyland, but it wasn't much, not much more than the Stampede." She yawned again. "Anyway, he knew I was from the church and respected that. Didn't take me anywhere wild, though I'm sure that Howard's on good terms with all the wild places." "Did you meet guys?" "Mm-hmm. That's why I went, to see if there was anyone more reasonable than the big guy here." "That was crazy," I said. "You tell her, kid," Uncle Alan interjected. Aunt Pearl laughed. "Well, reasonable or not, after 3 months away, I knew that I loved Alan Hayes, and the only thing to do was to come back and marry him." We grew silent once more. I was quite certain that if I got married, my husband and I would be like them, Aunt Pearl and Uncle Alan. We would be able to casually say we loved each other. We would hold hands even when our children were teens. My husband might address me by an affectionate nickname, the way my uncle sometimes called her, Quail. It was by now quite dark. My aunt had fallen asleep, her head slumped to one side. The small cousin to whom I had been administering a bottle of milk slept in my arms. Paula and Craig, curled up on the back seat, also slept. I said, "Everyone is tired," to my uncle, to let him know that I was vigilantly awake, that I would keep him company. "They sure are," he replied. We sped along, the pavement visible only as far as the headlamps beamed, the tall grass and scattered trees along the Saskatchewan highway now swallowed by the night. Calgary. I was going home, where I would have a few weeks remaining of summer, then yet another year at Bowness High School, another year of my life. But it would be different. I would be 15, stronger and clearer than I had been before. I was growing toward a quiet confidence that I could not yet articulate, even in my thoughts. I had learned more about my family's history, about what it meant to be Black in North America, about my own Blackness in 8 months than what I had cared to know all the previous years of my life. I was beginning to understand that I had the right to exist in my world. This may not be comprehensible to someone who has not lived as a peculiarity. The idea that a child must one day tell herself, "I am allowed I was meant to be. I have the right to exist. But when you are a Black child who looks out into the world and sees hostility toward Blackness, you begin to ask why. You look for rationality behind hostility until the day you realize that racism is not your responsibility. It is the responsibility of its perpetrators. That day you say, I belong in the world. I belong here in Western Canada, where my family has lived and worked for 4 generations. We drove on, the miles peeled away, back to Calgary and my life there.
That was really beautiful, Cheryl.
Thank you.
So we have a number of questions. So the first person, just bring it up. They want to know about the poster that's hanging behind you. They say that their family knew John Ware. So she was wondering if you maybe talk about that and your knowledge of that story.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I have been doing projects based on the life of John Ware for a long time, almost a decade. And I became interested in him as a child because growing up in Calgary, I loved the Stampede. I loved horses. I loved cowboys. And yet I didn't really see myself reflected in the history and literature about cowboys and horses and that whole mythology. So I kind of put that aspect of my identity away and aside until my brother and I discovered the existence of a great Black cowboy who had come to this part of the world in 1882. And that discovery was really key to my acceptance, learning how to integrate all the different aspects of my identity, that my history as a person of African descent in this part of the world, as well as, a wannabe cowgirl. So about 5 years ago, I started working on a film that is coming out very, very soon. It's going to have its world premiere at the Calgary International Film Festival on September 24th. And it's the 2 in-person screenings are already sold out, but people from anywhere in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba can stream. That's a cool thing. So yes, I love John Ware. Thank you for that question. It's very cool that your family knew him.
So 2 people had very similar questions where they just wanted to know, well, I'll just read one of them. We are loving your reading and introspective writing. Thank you. Did you get permission from your family to use the stories in your book?
Oh man, that's such a great question. It is one of the dilemmas of writing personal material where you are telling the stories of people that are not you. And so I did have the very enthusiastic support of most of my family, even about stories that were personal. But I do know that there were some places that they were irritated by things I said. For example, my Aunt Edie, who I loved dearly and who I mentioned earlier, had married a man from a more rural community, and her speech more closely resembled the speech of Black Americans. She was annoyed by that passage of the book. She didn't like it that I had said that. Overall, she did like the book very much. My mother read every single draft of it to her over the phone. They would just get on the phone at night and Mom would read to her. With Uncle Willis, I was worried about how his family might feel about what I wrote about him, because it does reveal his struggles with the bottle. But it turns out that they like it a lot. In fact, my cousin Georgie, who's named after my grandpa George, I saw him posting on Facebook a few weeks back, maybe a couple of months back, that Pouring Down Rain is his favorite book. So yes and no. I mostly had permission. Sometimes I just wrote what I wanted to write and was prepared for the consequences. But yeah, that is a dilemma of writing about your family for sure. I still wanted to have Christmas dinner with my family, so I did have to make some choices.
Yeah, I gotta bridge that gap and make sure. Somebody else is also wondering, how did you choose which memories to include and which maybe to leave out?
Mm. I would have to really go back thinking about the fact that it was 30 years ago. In some ways, I wanted to make sure that I included everyone. So I just thought about all my aunts and uncles and my cousins. The cousins that I grew up in Calgary, I wanted to make sure that um, they were named because they were such an important part of my life growing up. So my mom's two sisters, her twin sister Pearl, who I read an anecdote about, and her other sister Edith, and their families were very important in my life. So I wanted to make sure I included them. I wanted stories that illustrated my growth as I learned about my family history, as I wrestled with racism. I wanted stories that helped me to tell the stories of those signposts. But it's a really astute question because, of course, your life consists of literally thousands and thousands of days. When you're writing a memoir, you can't tell every story from every day. So it's a process, and there were a few different criteria that I used in choosing those stories.
I think we have time for one more question. So somebody would like to know, what was your original impetus for this book, Cheryl?
Another great question. As I said, I grew up in Calgary, but I never once encountered anything pertaining to Black history within my education, or the library that I haunted every Saturday and came home with a stack of books this big. We just simply were not there. And I wondered about that as I got older. Why was that? Why were our stories not present in the literature? I knew we were a multi-generational Canadian family. I grew up in an immigrant community where almost all of my classmates were first generation Canadians or second generation. So I knew that our history was old and long, and it simply wasn't there. And as soon as I had made the decision to be a writer, I knew that this was a story that I wanted to tell. I always was asked, "Where are you from?" I still get asked that all the time. And there's just simply not the awareness that not every person of color that one sees, or not every Black person, is a recent arrival. And I am not privileging whether or not you're an immigrant or whether or not you're first or second generation. I'm simply saying the truth of it is that we were here. We have been here for a long time. And I wanted a record of that. So Pouring Down Rain was the first of many, many projects I've undertaken over the years to try to tell that story.
Well, we really appreciate you being here today, Cheryl, and it was wonderful to hear you read the passages as well. It's just such a beautifully written book, and you've done so much for the history in the province as well. So we really appreciate you coming out today.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, all of you, so much who took the time to be with me. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Word on the Street.
Thank you.